Welcome to the CANIE Climate Dialogues, the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, and today, on our inaugural episode, Season 1, Episode 1, we're starting with what we're up against. We are getting real about the climate crisis. We are diving right in and not messing around. We are fresh off the heels of our International Education Climate Action Summit, Europe, so the CANIE team is feeling good, and we'll talk about that too. Later on, we are also going to be joined by Linh Do, a climate leader and climate change communications expert with more than a decade of experience. Her credentials are pretty impressive. We chat with Linh, who unpacks the reality for us in a conversation that is, in a surprise twist for the year 2020, remarkably hopeful. But today is fun because I'm joined by one of the co-founders of CANIE and also my friend on the other side of the world, Ailsa Lamont. Ailsa will be a frequent guest on the pod, CANIE Climate Dialogues, because she's brilliant and insightful, but also because we just kind of like hanging out while asking ourselves difficult questions, asking each other difficult questions about making a movement in the sector, the big ambitions towards cutting emissions, and everything that international intersects in terms of climate action. So super nice to have you here on the inaugural episode. Felt right, didn't really feel right having an inaugural episode without you.
Oh, thanks, CJ. You're right, I am blushing.
I set her up. I was like, this is gonna be really embarrassing. You're gonna love it.
I paid her to say all that.
Decidedly untrue as a volunteer-run organization. How's it going?
Well, it's a week since we had the CANIE Europe Summit, and it was, it went really, really well, even beyond my expectations. And I've still got a bit of a buzz, to be honest. It's, we unearthed so much amazing work that's being done all across Europe and beyond. And the speakers were fantastic. The production values, thanks to yourself, CJ, and your very talented team in Vancouver, were amazing. So we're just really happy with how it went. And more than that, I think it was kind of a validation of what we wanted CANIE to be when we set it up. The idea that we'd create a platform to A, shine a light on the issue, B, give people a forum to actually exchange good practice and find out what was happening, and C, try and raise the collective ambition and look at what needs to happen next on a big sectoral level. And I feel like we made progress on all of those last week, so I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, it was definitely, as mentioned, I'm in Vancouver, so it was definitely worth starting at 6 a.m. for. Would do again, 10 out of 10. And so for those of you who are listening, who maybe didn't find us by way of the action summits, and this was sent to you by a friend, or you came across us by accident, can you tell people a little bit about what exactly the content format about our International Education Climate Action Summit -Europe?
Sure. So it happened last week. It was a 3-hour-long live event followed by 2 hours of networking. And it basically showcased the work of institutions, providers, practitioners in the international education sector, mainly from Europe, but not solely from Europe, who are working to make our sector more environmentally sustainable. And that's through a number of ways, through working to reduce the emissions associated with the travel of the business of international education, or with the emissions associated with student mobility, people who are embedding climate literacy in curriculum or in study abroad programming, or what some of the national agencies in Europe, like NAFIC, our sponsor, or Movetia in Switzerland are doing, as well as looking at some of the research that's coming out. And it was just fabulous to see how much incredible work is being done and how advanced some of the thinking really is. We've done summits like this before for Australia, New Zealand, and for North America. And we had great content there too. You can check out those past summits on YouTube as well. But this one, I think, we as CANIE have got better at how we organise these events. And also there's just so much great work being done across Europe that I think this was the kind of jewel in our crown to date.
Yeah, and major bonus shout out to our sponsor, Nuffic, who supported us. That was great. We were able to pull together like really professional looking, both from a technology standpoint and from an artwork standpoint. We were able to sort of we were able to go a long way with sort of what we got. So that was really exciting. And you're right. You and I both worked and the team on the New Zealand Australia Summit on May 21st in Australia, and then again May 21st in North America. So 6 hours there. So as Ailsa mentioned, it is on YouTube, so you can check out. We split it up for your sanity and easy navigation into 9 different videos. Each anywhere between 6 and 30 minutes so that you can sort of have that digestible. We spared you the 2 hours of networking, though it was awesome, and look out for more CANIE networking events in the future. Just a bunch of amazing people wanting to talk about different ways to affect change. And can you share a little bit about how many registrants and participants we had? And talk about sort of the participation.
Yep, sure. So we had just under 400 people register from all over the world. In the end, we had more than 40 different countries represented, literally from every continent on the planet. And we had people from Venezuela, from Sri Lanka, Japan tuning in. And 2/3 of them who registered actually stayed live for the event. And a lot of people have already been in touch saying, when is the content going to be up on YouTube? Because they're dying to see it. The time zone can be an issue. And I say that as somebody who was emceeing it from 1 till 4 a.m. in Melbourne time. So, but we work in international education. Time zones are an issue. We just have to suck it up.
Yeah, here I am complaining about my 6 a.m. or I guess my 4 a.m. wake up call. And you were like, that you were up until like 5 or 6 in the morning that day. Perfect. So just before we are going to be joined by Lynn, a quick summary of what's next beyond the podcast, because we've got a lot of, one of the things we heard a lot of was, these were such great sessions. I want to hear more, but in order to keep it snappy and to keep everyone's attention on the time of YouTube, we definitely made sure to keep them short and sweet so that we could keep everyone engaged in their seats for 3 hours. So we will be inviting some of those speakers to be on the pod. So beyond the podcast, what is coming up next for CANIE?
Yep. So it's one of those great problems to have where we've actually got too many things that we want to do and we're having to focus in on what is going to have the most impact. So one of the next big projects, which I'm the most excited about, is leading up to the kind of super summit, which we've just started working on, which will happen at some point next year. And the idea of this is to actually bring together all the key players in international education around the world, be that the big providers, the big international education associations, some of the government bodies, some of the big university groups, get them in a room, it will be a virtual room, and basically lock the door until they commit to upping their level of ambition and committing to practical action to reduce emissions in how our sector operates and to start putting climate action at the heart of our strategy as a sector.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. And so you're going to stick around and we will bring Lynn into the conversation, who is a friend of yours from sort of previous life. All right, so before we're joined by Lynn, I am going to give you those credentials I promised earlier. Linh Do is passionate about climate justice and social inequality. She spent the last decade working across advocacy and engagement, media, and social enterprise. Lynn is currently the director of Leaders for Global Sustainability at the University of Melbourne, a Bertha Fellow, and a board member at Climate Action Network Australia. And I'm not done. In the lead up to the Paris negotiations, she served as the publisher and editor-in-chief of The Verb. There, she worked with a global team to localize and humanize stories from the UN climate change negotiations. Lynn was most recently Australia and Pacific lead for the Climate Reality Project, Al Gore's climate change leadership program, and brought over 800 people together in Brisbane during Climate Week Queensland. Lynn has worked with a wide range of individuals from high school students to the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. No big deal. And the Reuters Foundation as well. She's also a co-founder of the technology startup RSA, formerly led the community organizing program at the Australian Conservation Foundation, and has worked with the World Wildlife Fund on communicating policy. Lynn is signed with Claxon Speakers and has previously sat on both nonprofit and for-profit boards. Her work has been featured in Al Jazeera, Vogue, The Huffington Post, and Washington Post, among others. She is a member of Global Shapers, an initiative of the World Economic Forum. Some of her accolades, because none of those things before were massive accolades, include AFR Woman of Influence, Australian Geographic Young Conservationist of the Year, and Junior Chamber International Outstanding Young Person of the World. So she's super open and available for speaking and writing engagements. Definitely reach out and say hi at lynn@theverb.org. That is LINH @theverb.org. She can be found on Instagram at LynnLoop, LINHLOOP, and on Twitter, because we don't spend enough time on Twitter. But if you do spend a lot of time there, you should definitely add Lynn to who you follow. It's at LMDO. So, what an introduction. Welcome, Lynn, to the show. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. So exciting to be here and see CANIE launch a podcast.
Awesome. So I guess we're just going to get straight to the heavy stuff, which we're doing because if we're going to solve any problems, we have to fully understand the scope of what we're up against in the fight against climate change. We have to feel the urgency and have to face the truth. But that also includes the positive truth about what we have the power to change and what we have to be hopeful about. So here we are. And you two know each other, eh?
Spent a bit of time hanging out in some very weird scenarios, actually, now that I think about it. We met very normally, in a cafe, as most people do, but then we once spent time on a cruise ship together for a Japanese educational organization. So it's been multifaceted, the time we've spent talking and working on climate.
It has. We even shared a cabin.
That's true. I wasn't sure how much detail you wanted to reveal about my snoring habits.
Amazing. So that would be at your time with the Climate Reality Project.
Yes. So for the last few years, I was the Australian Pacific lead for Climate Reality, which is Al Gore's leadership organisation. And Ailsa had actually done the training just prior to me starting in the role, but she went to one of our trainings in the US. So we run these big flagship trainings in the US, in other international locations. Obviously this year, a few of them have been virtual as well. And part of my role there was really supporting a whole bunch of different people to make a difference on climate in a way that made sense for them, either personally or professionally. So I think, Ailsa, we might have first met in 2016.
Something like that, just after I did the Pittsburgh training and you reached out, and I think we're contacting a lot of the new cohort in the region. And you were just a fabulous support. And I remember actually talking to you back in the early days and saying, I'm starting to make connections with a number of different people around the world in international education. I think we might need some kind of organization, some kind of platform to bring people together. And yeah, you were one of the first people that I probably discussed the whole idea of CANIE with.
Yeah, and I really remember that conversation. And I think I saw so much of my role, maybe then and also now, is just being people's first cheerleaders if that's what they need, and just be like, yeah, that sounds great, you should definitely do it. But at the same time, about getting straight to the heavy stuff, it's like, yeah, that all sounds great, and here are some of the things I've learned and observed over the years that you should be like cautious of. And I think it's just like balancing that out. And for me, it's been really cool to see both through Ailsa, but now just like in the actual world, because CANIE exists and so many different people are engaged. When someone takes that first step, right, of acknowledging that the climate crisis is really urgent, and even if they haven't ever done anything on it previously, it doesn't mean that they can't start. And there's so many different ways that can go. And for me, that's sort of really exciting, and how I try to weigh out hi, my name's Lynn, have you heard about the climate emergency, with like a bit of positivity rather than just like, trying to guilt people into taking action.
Yeah, that's amazing. I remember when you joined one of our early board meetings and you were so positive and you were like, here are also some things that you're going to have to be real about. And I was like, oh, this woman has been talking about the climate emergency for a while, because she knows how to break the hard stuff in a very like effective way. And so on the topic of the Climate Reality Project, because you are now, Lynn and now Ailsa, have mentioned the trainings. I was recently trained in July, and the first cohort to be the digital training. I was supposed to go to the San Antonio training, and that got canceled from COVID. So here we are, trained in July from VP Al Gore. But I'm wondering if you can give people a quick elevator pitch of what the Climate Reality Project is, who sort of is behind it, and when you yourself were trained.
I'll do the organizational thing because even though I don't work there anymore, it's just like, it's so second nature, and I still use we. I'm like an us, and everyone's like, do you still work there? I'm like, I'm an ambassador at large. That's how it works, right? So Climate Reality was started by former US Vice President Al Gore after he made an inconvenient truth. I think in part because he realized that the documentary really did have such a profound difference in elevating people's understanding on climate change, but people will not care about an issue that is still perceived to be so abstract if they don't have a personal and direct connection to that. And often people tend to care about things because they know someone else who cares about climate change, poverty, whatever the issue happens to be. So we set out to develop this training program that normally runs over 3 days. Now virtually it runs over a bit of a longer period of time. So it's not just 3 days of constantly being online, and really giving that opportunity for people to get the knowledge, the skills, and the networks that they need to go out there and make a difference. And Ailsa, I'll let her talk a little bit more about her experience, but having worked at Climate Reality for, over 3 years, I did the training myself in 2007. So I've, really been in this ambassador at large role for quite some time, self-appointed, by the way. So I hope no one at Climate Reality listens to this later and follows up with an email. It's really about recognizing that for some of us, especially, this hasn't been what my experience has been. There are so many individuals out there that when they say they care and want to do something, they feel really isolated. So how can we provide them with some of that community? How can we provide them with the skills and content so they can feel confident to reach back out into their own lives and do something about it? So that's Climate Reality in a nutshell. And my role really meant that I got to meet awesome people like Ailsa, awesome people in like the agriculture industry, in the corporate industry, like just such a multifaceted number of individuals who are all doing really different things. And I'll let Ailsa share her story, but I think it's important for everyone listening to remember you could totally be one of these people that does the training now that it's online as well. And even if your story doesn't sound at all like mine or Ailsa or someone else's, that's sort of the point. The point is that anyone can take action. So here's a bit of a program that will help you make sense of that in a way that suits you.
Yeah, and I love the approach that the Climate Reality Project takes of going, you don't have to be an expert in climate science to be able to make a difference. What is actually really important is that you're somebody who's maybe got connections in whatever line of work in your field or profession. You've got some platform that you can use to talk to people. So we'll give you the basic skills to help you do enough. And I think as somebody who doesn't come from a climate science background, it can be really, really intimidating and a bit overwhelming at first. And you go, well, what if somebody asks me about this and I don't know this little technical thing? And and I found, once you just get started, it's fine. And if you're able to say, I don't have every answer, but you've got such a great set of resources and backup behind you to really help. And so, that's what the Climate Reality was able to do for me when I first started trying to work within the international education sector. And I suppose in a way, we're kind of taking that step further with CANIE, and we're trying to be that resource for people within international education. So taking that kind of generic, this is the climate emergency, this is what needs to happen, this is what has the most impact, and trying to translate that into more targeted messages and resources for international aid.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole point, right? Is at the end of the day, whether you're an expert on the climate science or not, every different community person needs to be communicated to slightly differently because of what they already know and what they already care about. I know very little about international education. I think everything I know about international education comes through CANIE. So I never could have been the person, even if I'm like a climate comms expert, to know what messages would resonate, to know what actual changes were needed. But that's, I think, where, the both of you come in and being able to work with a much larger audience in a way that the climate experts never could. And for me, there's just like a really beautiful, like potential, like Venn diagram there where you're like, aha, we found like the sweet spot.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I do want to talk about that a little bit later. But one of the really important pieces that the climate story being one of them, because it's people talking to people and humans talking to humans, and even the people who make policy and affect change at a large scale, those are people too. And so everyone having that climate story and feeling confident. To Ailsa's point, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know a lot about climate action, but I know a lot about international education. And so, being empowered to say, like, this is my climate story and I'm an expert in my climate story. And this is why I'm sort of doing this work. And that can inspire other people. I know I was inspired by Ailsa to take the climate reality leadership training, which we spent, online. It was over 10 days, a bunch of sessions over 10 days, totally manageable. We all had to stay inside anyway. So what else was I going to do? And, I want to take this opportunity as sort of the climate comms expert, having you here, sharing with our audience who aren't sure, don't feel like they're experts. What are the key points they need to know about the impact of climate change? I'm not talking about international education, but just like, let's be real about climate change for a minute. What is the important stuff that we need to know?
Oh, there's so much, right? And I think this is where experts in any field can get overwhelmed. You're like, I need to tell these people everything so that they know everything I need. And it's like, actually pick and choose, like, of what I say now, maybe like pick 3 of those things and have those 3 be your fun facts on climate change. I think, like, before I delve into that, though, one of the biggest things that's probably really important to recognize is, depending on where you're listening to this podcast from, you might not even need to know all that much about climate change other than the recognition that, yes, it's this issue that's happening. Over 99% of scientists agreed in a peer-reviewed manner, which, for people well-versed in the scientific method, that means a lot. For people that aren't, all that means is this thing is real. The conversation that happens more so in Australia, the US, a little bit in the UK, I'm sure pockets of Canada and really developed countries where English is one of the dominant languages around denialism can be really misleading. And I think that's where people's fear comes from. And again, even though I've worked in this space and on this issue for well over a decade, I still sometimes feel really like apprehensive, and I'm like, oh, do I need to know all of the latest facts? And what do I need to tell people so that they don't think that I'm actually lying and this is all a conspiracy? So one of my big real takeaways there is climate science has always been factual in terms of indicating that the world is getting a little bit warmer, and that's happening really, really rapidly. Humans are at the cause of that. Impacts will look really different depending on where you are. Not all natural disasters are a result of climate change. The word natural is there for a reason. It's more so the intensity of these natural disasters, the frequency of these natural disasters. For those in Australia, bushfires are pretty common in our existence. It's not something that is foreign to us. But over the 2019-2020 summer break, they were ferocious. It was the angry summer from hell. And I think that for a lot of people who were maybe on the fence or not entirely sure what climate change would actually look like and what the impacts would mean for people in like urban, privileged sort of settings, it was like, oh, right, this has like really the potential to upend everything. So impacts can be really quite multifaceted. One of the things that I've stopped doing, although I feel like I shouldn't admit this, I've stopped really reading climate reports in full, all of the new ones that get released. I'll always skim like the executive summary, I'll read the media commentary around it. And one of the reasons why I've stopped reading is I think I've come to recognize there's only so many facts I can hold in my mind. And most of these new reports that come out, it's not so much new information that's being released. And I think that's the important reminder, right? It's the updated information that's being released. And those updates are really just a reflection of how little action we're taking, or rather recognizing that obviously some people are taking action, but how we're just not doing enough. So it's not revelatory. It's just saying, hey, we released this report last year. We said that, you know, this percentage of the ocean is going to potentially have like warming, or like these corals might get bleached if we don't do anything. Fast forward 1 year, hey, we really didn't do all that much last year from a policy like perspective, or from like a corporate like governance perspective. So actually the bleaching is still going to happen, but when we said it was going to be X%, it's now X% plus an additional something else. So I think that's just something for people, who are listening now to just be mindful of, is pick a couple of the facts that will really resonate with you, that you feel make sense in the context in which you're describing climate, and recognize that that's probably not going to change drastically. And the main thing is, remember, the climate science is real. If you can, avoid the discussion there. And impacts really will unfortunately manifest in a lot of different ways that are hard to predict, other than knowing that things are going to happen at a higher degree of intensity and at a higher rate of frequency as well. But Ailsa, I don't know, what are the facts that you use, or even CJ, now that you've done the training, to talk to people?
It does very much depend on who the audience is. So, you know, I always, like recently I talked to some French business school students, so I picked some French local examples. There've been some massive floods in the southeast of France that people would have known about just recently. And then I sort of go local, national and international. And I mean, I think one of the things that I've found talking to different audiences, be that international students or educators, is that although most people now, especially in our fields, people are educated, they know that climate change is a problem, but most people haven't actually gone back at any stage and done that kind of refresh of, this is what's happening and this is what's causing it and these are the major things. And people want to take action, but they often don't know exactly what they can do, which is where they sometimes get stuck, or they get stuck on doing small things that might not have very much impact. Like a lot of people, when you talk to them about climate, they start talking about recycling. And, recycling is good and it should be done, but it's like, you're kind of missing the point here. And I suppose one of the questions that I have for you, Lynn, I'm really interested, and it's something I grapple with all the time, is, how to get the balance right between focusing on systemic action versus personal action. And I do think that personal action is important, not just because, every little drop helps and it builds a kind of bit of its own momentum, but more from that, the perspective that you're building a coalition for action. So, and every time you do something and you talk to somebody else about it, that creates more of a flow. But it's like, I think what we're trying to do with CANIE is try and actually identify where the bigger impact actions might be and help build a coalition around that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that issue.
I think it's something that every climate professional to some degree will grapple with, that balance of the personal versus the systems level change. And it was probably like quite a slow learning for me, that not everyone thinks from a systems perspective, and not everyone thinks that they can make such a change, both on a large level, or that the decisions that get made from up top, whatever that up top looks like, will impact them. And I think that's where the personal action piece really does make a difference, because it's a little bit about training, I think, that muscle that we all have within us to do things a little bit better. So, whether that's, today instead of like driving or catching public transport or even riding, I'll like ride my bike or I'll walk, and I'll like go that extra distance to fit in like some exercise. I think people have gotten really good at figuring out how they exercise a little bit more, especially during COVID when we're so sedentary. And I've started to think about climate action from that personal perspective in the same way. So yes, maybe it starts with recycling, and maybe it starts with like using a reusable coffee cup when you go to cafes when they're open again, depending on where you're listening in the world. All the things that I used to say as, standard sentences can no longer be repeated. That I think when it starts with that and it sort of normalizes that behavior, when someone asks you about it, you're able to share why. You're then able to open up a conversation about climate change, which you might not be able to do if you're not doing some of those personal actions that are really noticeable. And I think once you start to do those little things, it just builds up little bit of a dopamine effect. We're like, I feel really good for doing this. What's the next thing that I can do that will make me feel really good about taking climate action? Maybe that means I should like join a local community group that's doing something and help them by going door knocking or going to a protest or whatever it is that makes the most sense, by talking to other people in your workplace about it. So I think from small actions, big things also grow. And it's that reminder that an action can be really small because it's being done at an individual level. So when you have like 100,000 people doing that, it could still have a really significant impact. There's this really cool study and like work done by Harvard professor Erica Chenworth that shows in all sort of like social movement, protest, mass sort of, revolution type changes that have happened in history, it only takes 3.5% of the community or the society where that change is, hopefully going to happen within, to actively engage to make a difference. And I think about that when it comes to the personal action piece, because 3.5% of, like a workplace, a local community, doesn't sound as overwhelming as everyone has to do this. So if we can break it down to, hey, everything that you're doing does make a difference. Why don't you do a little bit more and make it a bit more visible, so that that adds to that 3.5% number, I think is really quite key. The other day, actually, on Twitter, I saw someone had posted, what's the thing that you wish the environment movement would stop doing from a comms perspective? And it was very controversial. And I was like, do I weigh in? No, let's just like read through the answers. And, I got aggravated at most of the responses. I was like, how dare they suggest we stop doing that? I love talking about that. And one of the really big ones was that climate justice or climate change folks should really stop shaming and belittling little actions. I think it's totally possible to say, think of it as like an improv thing. Hey, that's really great that you're taking personal action X. And have you considered also doing this next thing that I'm going to ask of you? Rather than, I think what so often when people are really frustrated because this issue really is urgent and it is like a massive crisis and it has the potential to upend so many lives, to dismiss the action that they see as wrong. And I know this sounds like a really airy-fairy response, because I get it a lot, but it's how do we just be more inclusive of meeting people where they're at? And if that's what they're able to do, then like let them do that. Isn't it better than them doing nothing at all? And using that as the launch pad to encourage people to do more. Again, like other, relatable things. When you're training a pet, like how are you going to encourage them to like do the right behaviors and habits? Obviously, I don't have children, so it's not about training children in the same way, right? But like, how do we teach children right and wrong behaviors? Not through just like screaming at them when they've done something wrong, but like encouragement. Positive psychology works for a reason. And I think that's something we forget with this issue because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, it's funny. You ask my partner and he'll 100% tell you I spend too much time on Twitter. But I also saw that, what's the one thing that you wish that climate activists would stop saying in terms of climate comms? And the one that got me was like, stop saying that humans and climate change are ruining the planet. It's not. It's ruining the ability of humans to exist on it. I was like, oh, so dark, oh, so real, which is like kind of what we face all the time with this work, right? When Ailsa and I first met and we were planning this summit, it was January, February when we first connected. I inserted myself into CANIE.
It's like COVID years are like dog years. They don't kind of work normally.
Yeah, but I inserted myself into this beautiful organization that was just getting off the ground, and we were like really engaged about how much we could affect change in the international education industry, and I found myself like just drawn to the conversations we were having, and we would have these conversations about change and how we could do change and why change was needed, and it was invigorating and like gave me life. And then, the pandemic happened and I was still finding comfort in the work that we were doing. And every once in a while we'd be like, oh yeah, like what a great idea. That was so awesome. Oh my God, I love this conversation so much. And then we're like, ugh, it was so nice not to talk about COVID. I'm like, right. We're actually talking about the climate crisis, which might be darker and is a much larger impending sort of crisis.
I think that's the difference, right? Is that like COVID was overwhelming, and there was literally nothing we could do about it other than the personal action. Like the personal action was like stay home, socially distance, wear a mask, like wash your hands, all of those good things that hopefully everyone is doing. But that was it. Like there was not much more you could do. There's definitely nothing like systemic that you could do. Definitely don't go to a protest for like a COVID related thing. Like not a good idea. Whereas I think the difference with climate is that, yes, it's a really big crisis. And, I'm sure some people have seen that image that's like the COVID wave. You think that's big. The climate wave is like humongous. But the difference is there's so much more we could be doing on the climate front, whether that's like from home, out and about in our communities that, are slowly, hopefully reaching zero cases. And that's how I think I am still able to wake up every single day and like work on climate and not just be like, oh, this is grave, like facing whether or not civilization should continue because of our bad habits and behaviors, and reframing that as, oh, look, here are the things that I could do today that hopefully tomorrow I can build upon. And other people are building upon this too. And that's how change happens, right? Hopefully.
Yeah. And that like it has been so incredibly positive, and it, a lot of the work that CANIE has been doing has kind of overlapped with or coincided with the COVID crisis. So you've got the two kind of parallel lines happening. One is, my God, look what actually happens when governments do use the tools at their disposal to take really large scale radical action that even if it does come at a cost to the economy. Not saying that all the climate action would, because it would also create other opportunities, but still. So like clearly we've got this incredible example now of some countries that have, or regions within countries that really have taken that action that is needed because they've just seen that this is a public health emergency. So that's one parallel with COVID. But the other one, and just to pick up on what you were both saying there about the positivity, like, it feels amazing when you can actually do something and make a difference. And I know that for many of us working in international education for a long time, you get caught up in what you're doing. You might be a little bit far removed from actually seeing the brilliant personal transformation that can happen to individuals when they get an international education, or you might be caught up on some aspect of international ed that's not directly giving you those benefits. And I feel like international ed in some parts has kind of lost its soul. That for a lot of people, they're doing what they do and they got into it because they love it. They got into it maybe because they were international students themselves and they see the benefit of it and they understand that it does have the power to transform lives, but it doesn't always. And sometimes there are bits of it that can be a bit, kind of murky around the edges. I find that when you work on this stuff within international aid, it gives you a purpose and it gives your work a value. And I think, we've just come off the back of the CANIE Europe Summit last week, which was a great success. And honestly, the energy from that, where people were like, we want to do something. We just needed a platform, or not just that. So many people are already taking a lot of action. And it was amazing to see that all grouped together and kind of showcased in a way that lets us actually celebrate the action. So yeah, it can be difficult sometimes if you get too kind of down in the weeds about this is happening. But if you start focusing on the actual great work, it can be just so motivating.
Yeah, I think the arc of this conversation speaks to what we have the power to do, right? Like, there are really dark things happening and people are being harmed by the actions that humans have taken in the systems that we are that we have built and continue to propagate. And there's change that needs to happen. But despite all of that, the arc of this conversation went from like, okay, there's some real dark stuff, and what is the important stuff that we need to know? And we just kind of naturally got to this place where, like, what do we have to be hopeful about? And it is like, even in the face of COVID and these lockdowns and the climate crisis that we are very much in. I know the city of Vancouver declared a climate emergency a while back, and I think just yesterday or at some point recently, by the time this airs, approved a 35-point climate plan. Every single point was approved. And so action will begin to be taken. And it's really amazing to see that, even though the climate reality is called a reality. I don't know about you guys, but the first 2 days of our training was just like, whew, okay, it's heavy. And I would say by the end of it, we were all so hopeful. And so I would end this conversation with one question before I specifically ask for sort of resources that people can go to get some of those basic facts, where good places are that people can just look. I know the 10-minute presentation, there's climate reality presentations happening all over the place all the time. But sort of, what is it that you are the most hopeful? Like, what is it that makes you hopeful? And how, like, Lynn, literally when your mic is on, there are birds chirping outside your window. It's like, it just sounds like pure hope and like bright sunshininess. And so I'd love to sort of hear the opportunity we have ahead of us to be hopeful.
I think for me, hope is so intertwined with action. I think I could not feel hopeful if I was just thinking about this issue. And that's not to say that, there's not important work in research, which is obviously a lot of thinking, but research is still an active, method of producing outcomes that help increase the knowledge that we have on climate or whatever other issue. So I think for me, my ability to remain hopeful, and the reason why I am so hopeful on climate change, is probably twofold. One is humans are inherently pretty selfish. We do care about our own existence. And if it's not going to be yesterday, today, it's definitely going to be tomorrow, for people to come around to this idea of, oh, so we can no longer live the way that we want to if we don't take action on climate change. Time to seize that opportunity, time to do something about it. So that's one. And that's obviously slightly pessimistic because of how I've just generalized all human existence. But then the other is, I was just saying, is that the moment you do something, if nothing else, even if it doesn't fundamentally and drastically change the world right away, you know that you've done everything that you possibly could. And I think measuring success, if you will, to use a very corporate term there, it's important to measure what it is you're in control of, and how you could potentially expand that sphere of control and influence, rather than, today, did I reduce CO2 emissions? That feels really that's a big ask. Maybe I did because I am the CEO of an organization and could make that decision. But for most people, it really is, at the end of today, did you do everything that you could to make a difference on climate change through talking to someone new about it, through trying to get a policy up internally? And I think when you are able to place your hope not just on this feeling that you have but on the actions that you're doing, you'll inherently feel better, and you'll be able to sustain a momentum and a pattern of continuing to engage.
Awesome. And you, Ailsa?
Yeah, I would just, I love all of that. And I think the idea that we as individuals have agency and we have power and we can affect things is just so positive and so powerful. And there are some people who are kind of born into, socialized into layers of their society where they feel like they have that power. But most of us are not. And certainly I didn't grow up feeling like I really had the ability to influence or affect change. And I've had to kind of learn the habit. I mean, I was always nosy and meddling, so that kind of helped naturally.
Same.
But I love what it's done for me personally, being able to go, right, there's a problem, we just need to fix it. And I see what it does in other people, and I love working with students for that reason. Like I've worked with a lot of international students who maybe haven't thought about this issue that much, and as soon as they get even like a basic bit of input, it doesn't take much, even an hour of just talking about these are the issues and these are some of the things that you could do about it. They're like, you can see the light come on and they're like, oh, wow, that's fantastic. And so many of them then start getting involved and active. And that's what gives me hope, I suppose, that it's one of the many, many examples of co-benefits that come from actually taking action, is that personally, it just feels bloody empowering and great. And it connects you with so many other like curious, intelligent people that, it's a win-win on every level.
Yeah. I know when I think about having been in a position to be able to give so much of my time to this work that we're doing at CANIE, like the incredible privilege I have to continue to have a job during these very difficult times, and to be able to have the position that I'm at sort of in my every day-to-day job, and having been exposed to the world and having had the privilege to travel and experience it. And I think about the journey that sort of by sheer happenstance brought me to you and to CANIE and to the Climate Reality Project, and how like I still am not an expert in the climate science, and I'm still not nearly as well versed. I'm only like 7 or 8 years in international ed, but like those two things together and being able to have those conversations we're in such a unique position. And the conversations that we have like now with professionals in the industry are so energizing and sort of feed my energy, and to see them connect things that they didn't connect before, and to sort of have broadened the scope of the power that they have, because we know that international education has a lot of power within an institution, and that institutions have a lot of power within our societies, within our sort of structural frameworks, our power structures, from political to financial. These institutions have a lot of power, and international has a lot of power within that institution. And so seeing in the conversations that we're having in the summits, meetings at conferences or virtual meetings now, having people realize the change and that the agency that they have, that their department has, that the institution has, and having played even just like a tiniest part in that, gives me a ton of hope, because there's, the 3.5% we were talking about. It's like, okay, that is an achievable number. And we're going to talk about climate justice being at the foundation of any work that we do on climate action. And I know we've got a lot of CANIE events and some content coming up on that, which I think is going to be really critical, because when we talk about sort of the impacts being disproportionately sort of affecting Black and Indigenous and people of color, I think is going to be like critical to that conversation. But it gives me hope that people are sort of having the realization of the intersection, that Venn diagram that we talked about, the racial justice, climate justice. So like and international education and how they all fit together, and sort of being able to see people realize the power that they have, and how that fits into the bigger picture is the thing I'm hopeful about being able to make change. And Lynn's right. Like, that's what gets us up in the morning, right? Like, I don't know about you guys. I'm like an indoor cat, let's say. So I like my self-care is like manicures, pedicures, and policy. So this has been like really good for me in that it gives me hope and energy, and it's super exciting. So, yeah, ladies, thank you so much. Any last words? Lynn, let's end with this. What is a great resource, a book, a presentation, a YouTube video? What is a recommendation for a good resource here?
I'll give 3 of different content varieties. So one is a book called How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference by Rebecca Huntley, that really, I think, breaks down this notion that you need to understand climate scientifically. It's actually more about understanding human emotions and the other person that you're talking to. So that's a book that I'd encourage people to read. If you're ever after, projects and like examples of, well, here are some of the technologies we have, but don't want to delve too deep into it, Drawdown is a really great website and also a book that people can check out. It's basically a compendium of, and they've actually just released an update. And remember what I said about updates before, but they essentially did the deep dive research into, here are 100 existing technologies that exist that can help reduce carbon emissions. What would happen if we actually implemented these to the full capacity? What would the outcome be in 2030 and 2040? So I think that's really a great sort of practical example. And then the other is, if you ever feel down and want to laugh about climate change, which I know sounds like an oxymoron and like a really cruel thing to do, I sometimes co-host a podcast called Irrational Fear with a comedian, Dan Illich, who's also done some work with Climate Reality. He gets on a whole bunch of different comedians, commentators to break down the daily news, and just, it's sometimes nice to be able to laugh and talk about climate change at the same time. And for me, it's definitely helped me be better in social situations to bring up climate change in a way that also is funny rather than just really dire. So they're my 3 hot recommendations for everyone.
Love it. That's amazing. We'll make sure that we link those in all our episode descriptions and on YouTube. So thank you so much. This was lovely. I can't imagine a better way to have started our inaugural podcast episode. So thank you so much. And with that, I will let you go on with your rest of your afternoon in Australia. It's just about dinner time here.
Thanks, CJ. That was brilliant.
Thanks so much. Can't wait to listen to the other episodes.
Okay, well, that's it for us and for me. That is a wrap on our first ever episode of the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast. Thank you for hanging out with us. Don't forget to check out our CANIE YouTube channel. Hello, if that is where you're watching us. And don't forget to subscribe to the pod wherever you're watching or listening. And while you're at it, send it to a couple friends. And if you're one of those friends who got sent this podcast, jump on that subscribe button. And you can see how this could all just keep going, couldn't you? But it won't. So be sure to join us for the next episode. At press time, we're not 100% sure who's going to be joining us just yet, but you can bet that it's going to be awesome. We will see you in a couple weeks. The CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast is engineered by Diego Mendez, who is based in Vancouver. He edits these episodes together, making us look and sound super professional. And also, he uploads these episodes to wherever you listen or watch this podcast.